Good morning, everyone. This is Paul Trianosky. I'm the Chief Conservation Officer at SFI, and welcome to day 2 of our 2021 SFI Annual Conference, Better Choices for People and the Planet. We're excited to be with you today. We're even more excited at the registrations. We have now over 600 registrants for this conference. We're very excited to be able to share the good work of SFI, our partners, and news and information that's really valuable to everyone in the forest sector and the supply chain sectors and sustainability. So we're going to be talking about all of that over the course of today as we did yesterday. So I do want to get started here shortly and without further ado, and we'll just mention that the upcoming session is called Collaboration for Conservation Impact and Species Recovery. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But I do want to mention first and just offer a brief introduction to our panelists to tease you a little bit so that you'll stick around and enjoy the session with us. And then we'll have a couple of housekeeping items and some background to offer as well. But I do want to mention our panelists. It's an esteemed group, and we're very proud to have them with us. And I'll mention them in this order in which they will present. First, I'll mention Lisa McLaughlin, who is Vice President of Conservation Policy and Planning at Nature Conservancy Canada. And Lisa is Vice President of Conservation Policy and Planning, as I mentioned. She's responsible for ensuring that NCC's land acquisition and management activities are guided by strategic priorities, informed by best available information. She's the lead liaison with many of their national and international partners, including government and non-for-profit organizations. And she's a biologist and rural planner by training. She has more than 20 years experience in the management of conservation lands and governance of private land conservation organizations. She has a great many accomplishments, too many really to list, but I will note that she's a member of the Privately Protected Areas Working Group of the World Commission on Protected Areas, and she serves as board chair for the Canadian Committee of IUCN. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Molly Hudson, who is the Director of Sustainability at Mosaic Forest Management. Molly is spent her career actually working throughout coastal British Columbia as a tree planter, timber cruiser, research technician, and biologist, all of which skills I'm sure serve her well in her current role. She's now responsible for Mosaic's certifications, community relations, and fish and wildlife management, including the Species at Risk program. Molly's a registered professional forester and registered professional biologist, and a proud member of PLT Canada's Green Jobs Mentorship Program, and we certainly appreciate that, Molly. Lastly, I'll mention that we have with us Dave Tenny, who's the President and CEO of the National Alliance of Forest Owners. Since 2008, NAFO has grown to 47 member companies that own and manage more than 46 million acres of private working forests, and 30 state and national associations representing tens of millions of additional acres. Under his leadership, NAFO has become a leading national advocate for the economic, environmental, and social benefits of America's sustainably managed forests. Dave's background is diverse. It includes roles with the American Forest and Paper Association, and also as Deputy Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment at the United States Department of Agriculture, where he had responsibility for the U.S. Forest Service. He also has served as counsel and natural resource policy advisor for the House Committee on Agriculture and as counsel for U.S. Representative Wally Herger of California. It's an esteemed panel. We will hear from them in just a few minutes. But prior to that, we want to get a couple things done. We want to make sure that we thank our sponsors, and particularly our gold sponsor, Rayonier. Thank you for sponsoring this session, and as well our silver sponsors, Bureau Veritas and Georgia Pacific. We're proud to have them sponsor this session, and I hope you'll join us when you can in helping to thank them as well. So let's return to our subject. You know, as I was thinking about how to really set up this session, I was compelled by the idea of collaboration. And so the idea of collaboration and partnership is something that runs very deep in the DNA of SFI. And it's been that way since the very beginning. That's been part of the way in which we operate and a hallmark of SFI's work. And so But there are a couple of milestones that I think are worth mentioning. One of those was the establishment of the Conservation and Community Partnership Grants Program in 2010. And when that program was started, one of the primary drivers for it was to generate partnerships and collaboration. It has been enormously successful in doing that. And during that period of time, we've had well over 150 grants made as a consequence of that program, totaling more than $15 million in terms of the amount of leveraged funds. But more importantly, it has generated those partnerships and has set us up to be in a position to leverage our partnerships even more effectively and to find new and creative and more targeted ways to work with our partners across the board. One of these ways is our conservation impact project. So about 5 years ago, we made the announcement that we were going to initiate this work to help describe the conservation-related outcomes associated with SFI certification work, particularly in the areas of climate change and biodiversity and water. Now, as we turn the corner on that 5-year period, one of the things that we did at that time was to redirect the conservation grants to be specifically targeted towards getting this work done. And that has been enormously successful too, and generated a multitude of partnerships along the way. So these are just some of the organizations that we have partnered with on that conservation impact work. And now at the 5-year mark, if you haven't signed up for our Conservation Impact Sounding Board session on Friday, I encourage you to do that, because we're going to be taking a look at the results of much of this work, and I'll just share with you a few of the media outputs that we've had surrounding some of our conservation impact work, and all of it is illustrative of the partnerships that make the wheels turn. They range across conservation organizations, academic institutions, our own certified organizations, and many, many others. And so this conservation impact work is turning out very real results. We're going to talk about that a little bit more on Friday. We have an esteemed panel on our Conservation Impact Sounding Board. And beyond this panel, I will mention also that you're going to get, if you're able to attend, you're going to get a real look at the compendium of results that we've developed and a rundown of what those results mean. And even more importantly, a look towards the future, because we're constantly advancing, constantly looking for continual improvement in SFI. And as we think about this conservation impact work, yes, we're 5 years in, yes, we have some results, but we're looking to make it better. We're looking to the future as to where we can go next, and we want to be sensitive to your input on how to do that. So I hope you'll join us if you can. I do want to mention a couple of projects, again, circling back to the notion of collaboration. There are so many projects that are really representative of this idea within SFI, not just within conservation, but across the multiple pillars of SFI's work. But I do want to mention a couple here. This is really exciting work that's being carried out by the Boreal Avian Modeling Project, the American Bird Conservancy, NatureServe, all in collaboration with SFI, other partners, and our certified organizations. These two projects actually show work that's taking place in the border region of the US and Canada. As a binational organization, this I think really represents the fullest expression of our ability to be able to reach across the border and to come up with conservation approaches and conservation partnerships that really show the best of what SFI can do at scale. One of the things we're very, very proud of that just occurred these past few months is that SFI was awarded a $200,000 grant by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And this is really a critical project in a lot of ways. It's critical because of the species that are involved and the work that's going to take place, but it's also critical because it marks a milestone in SFI's evolution and SFI's work in the partnership arena, so that as we think about this work, which is going to take place in West Virginia, it involves a certified organization, Weyerhaeuser, as well as our close friend and colleague, the American Bird Conservancy, with regard to bird conservation, and a dozen other partners as well that are engaged in this work with SFI at the helm, leading and helping to make it happen. And it will have long-term and vast implications, leveraged implications for outcomes well beyond the original project footprint. So I think it marks a turning point in the way SFI is perceived and the kind of work we're doing and how we think about our scale and think about our partnerships. So let's return to our session. I want to make sure that we get to our speakers as quickly as we can. And it is called Collaboration for Conservation Impact and Species Recovery. I can assure you that our knowledgeable and informed speakers are going to be talking about topics that range even beyond that, I'm sure, and they have much to tell us. But all of these partnerships that they're talking about involve SFI, they involve our certified organizations, and in turn, they'll be talking about other effective conservation measures, or OECMs, and species at risk, and how the SFI program standard can serve to validate and confirm the actions of our certified organizations in achieving the goals of species at risk management and perpetuation, and also the Wildlife Conservation Initiative. We'll hear from Dave more about that and some of the other great work that NAFO is doing. All of these things involving SFI in a very close partnership fashion, as I'm sure that you'll hear. And so that, I think, concludes my introductory remarks. We will turn now to our panel. And as you would expect, I have misplaced my notes. But Lisa, I believe you are going to be first. And we welcome you to the stage and offer you to share your screen. I'll quit sharing mine. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I will begin to share my screen. Right, Paul, I just need one more moment here.
That's all right, Lisa. As you're doing that, I'll just remind everyone that if you have questions, we encourage you to type those into the Q&A box and use the chat box for sharing comments and sort of in the sense of community amongst all of our participants. I will remind you also that this session is being recorded and that will be made available to the registrant. I'll be on the lookout for that as well. Thank you.
I'm just having a challenge putting it into presenter view here now, Paul.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you'd like to work on that a little longer. We could see another presentation.
Hi, Lisa. I can share your screen for you, and then or your PowerPoint slide for you if you'd like.
Let's just try that one more time.
Okay.
This is the joys of technology.
So Lisa, if you can't get it, Amy's happy to share that, and you could look on your own private screen if you're.
Sure, why don't we do that, Paul?
Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me, and sorry for the delay. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about other effective area-based measures and certified forests. And so, Amy, we can go to the next slide. There we go. Great. I thought we would start just by orienting you a little bit to where Canada is actually at right now. So in 2020, we had committed to achieving 17% conservation in our terrestrial and inland waters. And these goals weren't just any lands. These were expected to be areas of important biodiversity. And it wasn't supposed to just be a math exercise. These are areas that are expected to have effective conservation, that are equitably managed and well connected. And you can see from the highlighting on the screen, we also expected that these areas could be established via protected areas or something called other effective area-based measures. And so since then, we as a country have also committed now to protecting 25% of Canada's land and waters by 2025, and further now to protecting 30 by 30. These are obviously ambitious goals, especially if you consider where we are right now. And we'll go to the next slide, unless Amy, you can see that I'm doing that. So right now, Canada actually sits, we expect at least by the end of 2021, our data to show that Canada has put into some form of conservation around 13.8 of our terrestrial and inland waters. And so what this graph's actually showing you, though, is how slowly our progress has been. The annual percentage increase of protected areas in Canada over the last 30 years has been about 0.2% a year. And since the inception of the Pathway to Target 1, which was intended to help lay out the plan to get us to 17% by 2020, and which saw the historic budget investment of over $1 billion, our annual percentage increase has only changed to roughly 0.7%. So that's not very quickly. And to get to 25% by 2025, Canada needs to set aside an additional 1 million square kilometers to reach that target. So for our American colleagues, that's over almost 2.5 million acres in 3.5 years. So obviously our rate of putting lands into protected status is too slow. So let's just take a little bit of a closer look at what we can be doing to accelerate that. And we'll go to the next slide. So right now, almost all of Canada's protected areas have been established through government protected areas. So these are statutory or regulated protected areas. And like I said in the opening slides, there are other tools we could be using to recognize protected and conserved lands in Canada. And in fact, even within the protected area category, beyond government protected areas, privately protected areas and Indigenous protected areas can make up this part of the portfolio. And you can see from the slide that while they do exist in Canada, they are a very small portion of our protected areas. So beyond protected areas, though, there is this other tool that we could be using called other effective area-based measures. We'll go to that slide. You've probably heard of OECMs by now, but you're likely more familiar with protected areas. Protected areas are areas that have been set aside for conservation. This is the protection of biodiversity, and there are mechanisms in place to ensure that they will be effectively managed over the long term. And so those might be federal parks, they also might be privately protected areas. When you start thinking about what those targets also enabled, which were the other effective-based measures, at the time when those goals were set, the global community and Canada didn't really know what those measures might be. But the intention here was to recognize land that have been set aside for purposes other than conservation, but because of the way they're managed and the mechanisms that are in place, they are producing biodiversity outcomes, and the intention is long-term conservation. So in a nutshell, the difference between these two categories is protected areas are established for conservation purposes, and the OECMs are established not for conservation necessarily, but because the way they're managed, there is important biodiversity outcomes. There's a whole guidebook on this, which you're welcome to learn more about, because there's obviously more nuanced differences between the two, but they are intended to be equivalent forms of conservation. And so right now, I think there is a bit of a conversation about how protected areas might be more protected than OECMs, but the intention of these two categories is equivalent forms of conservation. And in this next slide, I'm going to just run through two very quick examples to orient you on OECMs in Canada. The first example here is a military base. This is Canada Forces Base in Shiloh, and it is an active military base for training. Obviously, conservation is not the primary purpose of these lands, but the way the lands are managed and the agreements that are in place between the Department of Defense and Environment and Climate Change Canada, there is the intention for long-term protection of the biodiversity. So that is a government-to-government agreement around that protection. Another example here is in the province of British Columbia, in which they have recognized over 38,000 square kilometers as OECMs. These are old growth management areas and wildlife habitat areas, and they also include watershed protection for the city of Vancouver and the city of Victoria. And so these areas have the same elements in that these lands were not set aside for conservation, but because of the formal agreements and the way they're managed, they have biodiversity outcomes. Both of these examples are government-enabled OECMs, but the OECM designation, just like protected area designations, can be on private land and it can be on private tenured lands. But there's a process to go through to have these lands recognized. The process itself actually in Canada started in around 2018 when Environment and Climate Change Canada convened a group of people to help establish a common understanding of the criteria that would need to be in place for an area to be recognized as a protected area or an OECM. This group has been made up primarily of provincial protected area staff and me, but now there's a few other people who have joined that group. And our job was to create that criteria. And my function on that, though, was to help bring voice to the privately protected area lands and to encourage Canada to think more broadly about how managed lands, and including managed forests, could contribute to Canada's conservation goals. Essentially, we're trying to make more room for more players in conservation. Presently, the criteria and the guidance are available, publicly available, and there is a decision support tool that's available for people to be able to look at their projects or their lands and see if they meet the criteria. In my view, we have opened the door to OECMs in Canada, but I do think we still have a ways to go to have more of them recognized. And in fact, to actually develop the idea that OECMs are an equivalent form of conservation, not just protected areas being sort of the gold star of protection. And so while anyone can fill in a decision support tool to evaluate their properties, it is actually the provincial staff that decide if these lands do meet the criteria or not. And while the decision support tool and the criteria for OECMs is intended to be a pan-Canadian tool, many of the provinces are also still applying their own criteria on top of the criteria established in the decision support tool. And by and large, those criteria are more restrictive than they are permissive. And so in this process of evaluating OECMs, we really must be working with our provincial counterparts to ensure that the projects are going to get the support they need and that we're addressing the concerns of the provincial staff. Once your lands are agreed, though, that they meet either the protected area or OECM designation, they are submitted to the Canadian database of protected and conserved areas. And then it is the responsibility of Environment Climate Change Canada to further submit those lands to the World Database on protected areas. So while we were working on the criteria, of course, we're thinking about real life examples. And so NCC spent a lot of time thinking about what are private lands or private tenures on public lands that could be meeting the criteria of OECMs. And what are the mechanisms, like what are the legal agreements or the other examples of being able to say these lands are intended to be set aside for the long term. And as it turns out, we were certainly not the only ones thinking about this. So in this next slide, this is a list that shows you a list of a number of our NGO partners, our funders, as well as the leaders in the forestry sector who also were thinking about OECMs and forestry. And so we decided to work together and create an OECM forestry coalition. We wanted to be able to share our collective learnings and experiences together. And so as a group, we put together a plan to do work over about a year and a half. And that work is intended to identify willing companies, forestry companies, who are interested in OECMs and thinking about how their lands that have been set aside for purposes other than harvesting might be able to meet this criteria and how they might be able to demonstrate the biodiversity outcomes and be recognized for it. So we have set some goals of having around 7 projects, and SFI is working with private tenure holders on Crown lands, and the NAFO Conservancy of Canada is working with private landowners, private forestry owners, to evaluate their lands and see how they may or may not be meeting the criteria. Because this is such new work, part of this goal is also, though, to document our learnings, to identify the barriers and see where the opportunities are as we move through them. And that's partly because we know how big the opportunity really is in the certified forest space. And this next slide will be no surprise to this audience. If you just look at certified forests in Canada, they make up approximately 164 million hectares. With that figure, of course, not all that land right now would meet the criteria of an OECM or a protected area, but we think that within that, a rough estimate might be upwards of 10 million hectares actually might meet the requirements of an OECM. And so we thought that would be a really good place to spend some time exploring with the coalition. We'll go to the next slide here. So as I said, SFI is working directly with the certified companies that have a private tenure on Crown land, and NCC is working with certified forest operators on private lands. And as we're learning, it's very early days, but some of the key issues we already know we want to explore further is the role of working with the jurisdictions. So working with the provinces to understand their issues and needs more thoroughly, and looking at how we can close any gaps that they've identified. We really want to explore how certification and that the auditing process of certification really could play a more robust role in supporting OECM designations. And also how this idea of a stacked mechanisms like certification in addition to legislation, in addition to company policies, may as a grouped unit actually be able to demonstrate the intention for long-term conservation. We're also really well aware, though, that as a new designation in Canada, we might just need new tools. And so we're also exploring what those tools might be, whether those might be legislative or policy tools, to see how we can create more space for recognizing OECMs in Canada. And lastly, we also want to really be thinking hard about incentives for motivating forest operators to want to be a part of this community. Forest operators obviously already do so much work in this space. So what would be motivating for them to want to have their lands recognized as OECMs? But also, what could OECMs be doing to help the operators manage their lands better? So there's a lot of thinking going on right now. I think I will leave it there, Paul. I would just like to invite, though, anyone who's listening today, if you're interested in OECMs or if you're interested in understanding how your certification might be playing a role, I would really encourage you to reach out to SFI staff or to me directly, just to learn more about what the coalition is doing, where we're at, and how you might be involved. Because, of course, we want to make this a community event, and we want to make sure that this is something that is going to be useful for the operators on the landscape, as well as for conservation and biodiversity in Canada. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Lisa. We appreciate that presentation very much. Just as a reminder to everyone, if you do have questions, please do type them in the Q&A box, and we will return to those at the top of the hour following the presentation by our panel, and we'll direct those questions outward to the appropriate spots. But please do keep track by helping us out with the Q&A box. And with that, we'll turn it over to Molly Hudson.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, everyone. Well, at least it's, I think it's still morning in your time zone. I want to start before I launch into my presentation here by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Snow-Nawas First Nation here in Nanoose Bay, BC. So let's kick it off. I'm going to talk to you today about species at risk in Mosaic forest management's world and how certification plays a role in that. So I'll introduce our company, our approach to species at risk management, how it ties into certification, and then touch on the collaboration for the benefit of species recovery theme by highlighting the SFI species at risk module, which was launched in 2019, and how Mosaic and others were involved in its development. And I'll finally wrap with my perspective on what the future of species at risk management might look like, and in particular, how forest management will continue to lead in this space, in my opinion. So let's start with Mosaic Forest Management. We're a pension fund owned Canadian timberlands company responsible for management of both private and public lands on the west coast of BC, primarily here on Vancouver Island. Our private land base is the largest in Western Canada, and it grows predominantly second and third rotation forests. We sell our logs to both domestic and international customers, and also offer our management and marketing services to other landowners, including many First Nations. And our business could not be successful without a responsible stewardship approach, and certification is really central to that stewardship mandate and to our business model overall. So I have a few of our certifications up on the screen here, and I'll highlight just a few of the ones that we hold, starting with why we're all here today. Our SFI certification is really the keystone of our forest management and the primary indicator externally of our commitment to responsible and transparent forest management practices. Next up, you'll see PEFC, our chain of custody certification, which brings us access to our international markets for our certified logs. In the bottom left, you'll see our progressive Aboriginal relations certification, demonstrates our commitment to our relationships and our work with Indigenous peoples, in particular, the nearly 50 First Nations on whose traditional territory we operate in or adjacent to. And we're really proud to be the first forest company in BC to be certified to this standard, and we were elevated to silver level in 2020. Finally, on the bottom right, you'll see that Mosaic's entire carbon footprint was verified and certified by the Forest Trust. We're really proud of that, and we've committed to carbon neutrality as an organization by 2035, and we'll be excited to be a positive carbon sequestration business after that date. All of the certifications here include independent third-party audits, and they provide that external assurance that our practices and products are both environmentally and socially sound. So as I said, key to our business. So now let's turn to Mosaic's perspective on species at risk management, and particularly how it plays out in the forest sector. Species at risk management can be complex and dynamic, and I think that's why many of us enjoy that work and this particular challenge. And there are a few key principles that I think support good species at risk management. Firstly, at the top, evidence, data, science needs to drive decisions. And I'll highlight here that I think a multi-species approach is key to species at risk management in the forest sector, rather than managing the many individual species and habitats one at a time. Take a holistic view through an area-based multi-species approach for management. Secondly, we need to be adaptive and apply adaptive management principles, improve outcomes over time through structured decision-making, and really bring that continuous improvement flavor into our management decisions. Finally, and on the theme of this panel, management needs to be collaborative, it needs to be partnership focused, and we need to share common learnings and build together. So at Mosaic, we manage many species at risk, and we believe, as many here today I'm sure would agree with, that our managed forests have an important role to play in species management and in recovery. And so in our area, we manage what I call the big three, the northern goshawk coastal subspecies pictured here, the marbled murrelet, which is a seabird that nests in terrestrial forested habitat, and the Vancouver Island marmot, which is an endemic mammal on our island, and a large proportion of their habitat exists on our private managed forest lands. There's provincial and federal legislation that we adhere to, but SFI certification is really the foundation of our species at risk management program and has been since we became a certified organization a few decades ago. So the SFI forest management standard has multiple objectives, performance measures, and indicators that touch on species management. I'm going to highlight a few here. As they're listed here, this is how they appear in the 2015 to 2019 forest management standard, which we all know is extended to the end of 2021. These principles and objectives will transition obviously to the new standard, but they may have a different order. So starting off, principally, the objective 4 requires that program participants protect threatened and endangered species. And it actually specifically suggests in the standard that plans for protection can be achieved through collaboration, and we agree. Objective 9 requires that program participants obviously comply with the applicable forestry and environmental legislation. And objective 10 requires investment in research, science, and technology to inform our forest management decisions. And on that note, on this slide, you'll see that we have an acoustic recording unit that's used in our small owl inventory surveys. So playing into that research and technology piece of the standard. And now to dive a little bit deeper in that collaborative theme for species at risk management with a Canadian example, a recent Canadian example. About 5 years ago, the Canadian Federation of Forest Owners, which is an association for private landowners, large and small, in Canada, began work with the federal government, with Environment and Climate Change Canada, to discuss species at risk management on private lands particularly. And this work was formalized through the signing of a memorandum of understanding between the association and the federal government. The association wanted to increase certainty around the risk that habitat management can bring to private landowners. And the federal government was interested in exploring ways to partner with the forest sector to improve species outcomes. And what we also saw emerge on the side of the forest sector was that this was a huge opportunity to bring the government up to speed on all of the great work that forest companies do for species at risk, in particular, the great work that SFI-certified private landowners do. We were really interested in getting credit for the good work already being done. And so 2 regional pilots were developed, one hosted here on the West Coast with Mosaic Forest Management, and one on the East Coast with J.D. Irving. And the parties listed here on the slide were all involved, as well as representatives from the BC and New Brunswick provincial governments. The pilots focused on assessing current practices and identifying any potential gaps between current practices and existing legislation. The assessments were conducted by the Forest Certifications Audit Team at KPMG and found that we had met or exceeded the requirements of the published federal recovery plans. And so through these assessments and through field trips and many collaborative sessions, this project moved towards the idea of developing a voluntary species at risk module, which would be additional to the SFI forest management standard. And SFI had been involved in these conversations from essentially the beginning, and we're keen to run with this idea. So the results of this great collaboration was the Threatened, Endangered, and Species at Risk module, which was launched by SFI in 2019 as a voluntary module additional to the forest management standard. The module was intended to document the practices of program participants, increase transparency of these practices through public reporting, and that transparency would then serve to provide assurances, demonstrate conformance, and provide information to regulatory agencies regarding the identified species that would be audited. It really provided the opportunity, again, to bring to the fore and make transparent all of the good work already happening in the forest sector. So I see this module as a really positive step in the management of species at risk in Canada in the forest sector. It benefits the sector itself through increased certainty, incentives for good management. It benefits government through increased knowledge around forest sector management and provides assurances around the effectiveness of its legislation. It contributes to the body of science around species at risk through that continuous improvement theme, driving the building of the knowledge base. And finally, and most importantly, it will benefit the species with this elevated profile and certification. Practices broadly can improve, and knowledge and collaboration can drive that broad improvement across the sector. So I am, and Mosaic is very supportive of this approach. However, Mosaic has not yet chosen to adopt this module. And the reason for that, we were involved in the development of the project, and we very much believe that this is a great future approach. But what we'd like to see next is that the continued engagement and collaboration that's still ongoing by the groups I listed earlier and many more leads to an endorsement of the module by regulatory agencies as a robust and defensible indicator of a program participant's management of species at risk. And I think that once that happens, we'll begin to see increasing adoption of this module across the Canadian forest sector. With that demonstrated success, maybe we'll see elements of this module make its way into the SFI forest management standard somewhere down the line, but I won't speak for SFI there. I absolutely see this as an opportunity for regulatory agencies in the Canadian forest sector to continue this important collaboration on species at risk management. And I know that Mosaic is happy to continue to participate in that collaboration in the future. And on that note, Paul, I'll conclude and turn it back over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Molly. So 2 great projects that we've heard about thus far that directly involve our certified organizations, that directly involve the opportunities for achieving management at scale. And that's a great theme leading up to our 3rd presenter, Dave Tenny from the National Alliance of Forest Owners. And I know Dave has a lot of thoughts as well about how to achieve conservation at scale through the work that they're doing with our mutual friends and partners that he'll tell you about. Dave.
Thank you, Paul. You know, every panel discussion has its highs and lows. Molly and Lisa have done an extraordinary job, and now it's my turn. So we'll see if we can keep it at least somewhat high. Let me share my screen and talk to you a little bit about some of the things that we're doing. I want to tell you a story really about conservation partnerships within the National Alliance of Forest Owners, but more importantly with partners. And SFI is going to play an important role in this story. Let me start by describing where we are. So NAFO has 50 member companies. We have 31 association members, and our footprint is pretty broad. When you look at our footprint across the United States, it really encompasses just about any geography that has a lot of trees in it. But it also encompasses political geographies that require us to learn how to speak just about every political dialect there is. And in each of these areas where we have both a geographic and a political footprint, we have an economic and an environmental footprint as well. So one of the most important things that we have to be able to do as an organization is to speak credibly and to act credibly, so that as we're engaging all of these different constituencies where our footprint is rich, we can do so in a way that will actually make an impact in a good way. And so as we created this organization a few years back, we immediately crossed an important threshold. And that threshold was this: if we are going to have this credibility that's necessary for us to speak political dialects, it's necessary for us to be able to provide not just economic benefits, but also environmental benefits in every place where we work and where we own and manage land, then we better have a standard that enables us to do that. So our member company CEOs agreed that it was necessary for us to have a sustainability commitment that would be a requirement for membership. That commitment is punctuated by third-party verification. So every member company that is part of NAFO is subject to third-party verification. By far and away, the most common way to do that by nearly every company is certification. Our member companies are certified to the SFI standard, they're certified to the FSC standard, and some are certified to the American Tree Farm System standard. Some are certified to multiple standards, but every one of them is committed to sustainability and to this verification of their practices. That's a bedrock and foundational principle, and it plays out in the story that I want to tell you. A few years back, we decided that we wanted to describe everything that we do in a single sentence. And this is where we landed. This sentence has to be able to speak not just to our economic impacts and our aspirations, but also our environmental impacts and aspirations. And it has to be able to speak to the various dialects that we've learned along the political spectrum. So here is the sentence. Healthy markets provide clean air, clean water, wildlife, habitat, and jobs. I can say that in an elevator in less than 5 seconds. And that sentence governs everything that we do. So everything that we do as an organization now has something to do with healthy markets and it has something to do with clean air and clean water and wildlife habitats and jobs. I'm going to focus on those three aspects in the middle, the clean air and clean water and wildlife habitat. And I'm going to start by talking about climate change and what we do with climate change. We grow things, we harvest things, and we replant things. That's what we do. And as is the case with every piece of our simple sentence, when we talk about air or climate change, we also have a simple sentence that describes what we do there as well. And that goes like this: markets plus trees plus wood equals mitigation at scale. If we're going to provide climate mitigation at scale, we need to be able to harness the power of markets, the power of our trees, and the power of wood products in the built environment. Now, here's what we find. People who care about the climate want the mitigation that comes from what we can do: growing trees, harvesting trees, using wood in the built environment. But they also want the assurance that by providing those carbon benefits, we are also taking care of the water. We're also taking care of wildlife habitat. We're also taking care of a whole variety of environmental benefits that are also important, the co-benefits that we all know about. Well, what does certification do there? Certification provides assurance that we are able to both provide carbon benefits and the other co-benefits that people care about in a forest. If we're going to provide more carbon, yes, we want to provide more carbon, but we also want to take care of the air, and we want to take care of the water, and we want to take care of the wildlife in the process of doing that. Certification is our stamp of approval for the sustainability of our practices in these other areas. When we talk about wood in the built environment, people want to use wood in the built environment, and they want to be assured that wood in the built environment is going to also provide clean air, clean water, and wildlife habitat. Well, certification can help there too. As we're talking about embodied carbon and carbon benefits in the built environment, we can also talk about what's happening in the forest. We have a fiber sourcing standard that SFI uses. Other certification programs have similar standards that they use to ensure sustainable sourcing, and that the principles that we care about from the co-benefit standpoint are also being addressed in the process of providing carbon benefits. All of this rolled up recently in an exercise that our CEOs engaged in with some of our important partners. Last year, member company CEOs from NAFO collaborated with their counterparts at the Nature Conservancy, Environmental Defense Fund, American Forests, and the American Forest Foundation to adopt a set of CEO principles. The premise of these principles was to provide leadership, accountability, and vision for how we were going to use private working forests as a carbon mitigation or climate solution. Fundamental in those principles is this concept that you see on this slide. We want to make sure that everything that we're doing is sustainable. And one way that we demonstrate sustainability is through forest certification. Again, forest certification became one of the bedrock principles of what we're doing to address climate change. This, as I mentioned earlier, it applies not just to the forest, but it applies to the built environment. Jason Metnick and I were recently engaged in an exercise where we were talking to architects and builders and project developers, and they knew very little about trees, but they did know about certification. And so when we talked about certification as a way of demonstrating our commitment to sustainability to trees, there was a little bit of a shortcut that we could use that spoke a lot in very few words about co-benefits. So we could not just talk about carbon, we could also talk about sustainability through certification. Let's talk about wildlife for a moment. Paul talked about our wildlife conservation initiative, and this is something that we're particularly proud of and that we are extremely committed to. And here's the story. It goes something like this. We know that there are a lot of species at risk in the United States. And this is simply a map of the southeastern United States. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 species at risk that are potentially listed species under the Endangered Species Act, or that are the subject of great concern or even litigation in order to preserve those species and to make sure that they're thriving. As we looked at this, we realized that 60% of the species at risk depend upon private forest land as for their habitat and their survival. So we asked ourselves a question: what is the most important thing we could do to help address these species and conserve them? And what we came up with is what we now refer to as Wildlife Conservation Initiative. The premise of the Wildlife Conservation Initiative is that we would go to those places within the Fish and Wildlife Service, every region where we have significant land holdings. You saw the map. And we would identify conservation projects that we could do to conserve species at risk. That was it. And we needed to be able to bring something credible to the table in order to do that. So here's what we did. We asked every member company at NAFO to give up their most prized possession and put it into a common pool. This is the proprietary data that's in the shape files that describes all of the features and all of the attributes of their land that is highly proprietary. We asked them to pool that into a common place, the National Council of Air and Stream Improvement, and allow the Fish and Wildlife Service to have access to that information so that they could go survey and do other research for species at risk. That was a big ask. But our CEOs were willing to do that. Our member companies were willing to do that, and they have. The second thing we thought we could bring to the table was this idea of certainty. Where do we find the certainty? It's in the practices that we commit through sustainability and through certification. And so we could bring certification to the table as a commitment to continuing the kinds of practices that we wanted to share with Fish and Wildlife Service for species conservation. And then the third thing that we wanted to bring to the table was something we were going to have to earn, and that was trust through an enduring commitment that would create a collaborative culture with Fish and Wildlife Service and with other partners. And so we have been working for several years to accomplish this. When we walk into the door to talk to the Fish and Wildlife Service, the first thing we want them to do is smile and be happy seeing us walk into the room. That's a lot better than being happy only when we leave. And so our approach is to sit down with our partners in the Fish and Wildlife Service and our partners with state agencies that are responsible for species conservation, and with partners like SFI and with other landowners. And we ask a few simple questions. Number one, what are the most important species? What's important to you? What's important to us? Can we identify a few common priorities? Number two, is it scalable? If we're helping one species, is it scalable in that the habitat will benefit many species? Three, can we engage this broader community? Can we all get behind this effort so that we can all share in the outcome, the success of the benefits that we're providing to society? And four, this is really important. Can we tell a compelling story? Nothing breeds success like success. And can we tell a story that is so compelling that others will want to adopt it as part of their own story and engage in similar types of cooperative collaboration? Our friend, the gopher tortoise, is a wonderful example of what we're talking about. In the southern United States, we have this charismatic little creature called the gopher tortoise. Its habitat is also the habitat for 200 plus other species. So as we've worked collaboratively with our friends in Fish and Wildlife Service, with our friends in the state agencies, with SFI, with other landowners, and a whole variety of other conservation organizations and stakeholders, we have now engaged and are succeeding in conserving this wonderful little critter. And to the point that we are confident that we will not have to worry about using the Endangered Species Act to preserve this species, because we will have already committed to do the conservation work that's necessary to keep this this wonderful tortoise and all of the other creatures that, that benefit from the same kind of habitat in a very positive environment that will enable them to thrive and survive and continue to provide a lot of other benefits that people enjoy. It's a great story. Who doesn't want to get to know the gopher tortoise? It's a story that breeds success. And it's a great example of what we're talking about. We're finding that we're having success around the country now in a bunch of different places and in a variety of different ways. Whether we're talking about fishers and owls on the West Coast, or pollinators, or aquatic species, or songbirds, bats, and our friend the gopher tortoise, we are finding that in every region of the Fish and Wildlife Service, we are having success, so much so that the agency is now committing funding for the research projects that we're doing, $1 million so far, more to come, and it's drawing the attention of others. And what has happened is that as success breeds success and storytelling inspires others to adopt the effort, we now are engaged in a broader effort called the Conservation Without Conflict Coalition. Conservation Without Conflict is not just about forests, it's about other landowners, about ranchers and farmers, and it's spreading across the country. SFI was a founding member of Conservation Without Conflict. How do we know that conservation is without conflict is catching on? Well, Conservation Without Conflict is known by the administration, was mentioned in the rollout of the America the Beautiful 30 by 30 commitment as an example of the kind of work we want to do on working lands in order to accomplish the administration's goals and the goals of many to conserve 30% of our air and land and water by 2030. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but that work is premised on a lot of good work that's already being done. So what's next? Well, we want to talk about water, we want to talk about air, and we want to talk about wildlife in new and powerful ways. So we are engaged in working on what we are going to call our environmental benefits report. We're working with SFI, we're working with NCASI on this. And the premise is very simple. Can we identify a few basic metrics that we can, that are highly relevant, that are measurable, that are replicable, that will enable us to tell a story over and over and over again about the impact that we're having on air, water, and wildlife. One of the wonderful things that certification brings to the table here is that those metrics are being measured all the time. So if you are certified to the standard, you are measuring what you're doing in these areas, and we can pull a few of those metrics and tell a compelling story that's as compelling as the economic story that we've been very good at telling for a long time. This environmental benefits report then becomes an umbrella report that describes in audiences such as ES&G audiences or policymakers or anyone else who cares what the top line story is for private working forests, and especially for NAFO members here in the United States. Underneath that story, individual member companies can tell their personalized stories about what they're doing in these same areas. It can be a very powerful tool. Recently, as we've embarked on the work that we're going to do on water quality, we discovered that SFI and NCASI were already engaged in a partnership that was looking at best management practices across the country, compliance to best management practices, and some of the benefits that come from that. Wonderful. One of the benefits of collaboration is that you become quickly aware of the work that your partners are doing, and then you can collaborate into something that is even more powerful and bigger. And so that's what we're up to now. We can use this wonderful relationship that SFI and NCASI has, and we can bring our member companies in and tell an even more compelling story because of the work that our member companies are doing above and beyond the requirements of best management practices. That's going to make that environmental benefits report even more powerful. It's going to make the story of conservation even more powerful. And it's going to help us all move forward in accomplishing what we want to accomplish for the air, the water, and the wildlife. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And hopefully there's enough there to get a discussion going, and looking forward to that. And as they say in Washington, I will yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from SFI.
Thank you very much, Dave. We appreciate the tone of your conversation and the collaborative nature of the work that you're doing, and always find good partnership together with NAFO and your member organizations as well. So at this point, I want to turn to questions. There have been a handful of questions that were raised in the Q&A box. I think some of those were in fact answered, but I'll turn to my colleague, Jason, who I think may want to see if we can readdress some of those just for the sake of public conversation as well. Jason.
Great, thanks, Paul. And yeah, Lisa, you did an excellent job in answering the questions that came in the chat directed to you. I'm curious, though, if you could maybe just summarize some of those responses just for the benefit of other people, of other participants. And specifically, I think we got a lot of questions around OCEMs, how it relates to protected areas, how they're defined, specifically around protection and conservation, and then also just how long these OECMs last for and the long-term status of these.
Sure, yeah, I can speak to that. These are some of the issues that we really wrestled with when we were writing the criteria. So I can tell you that there is no set timeline for OECMs. Just like protected area, the intention is long-term protection. So it's not like you're committing to 20 years or 10 years. The intention is long-term. The definitions really emerge from the IUCN, so the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And then every signatory country then takes that international guidance and they try to apply it within their own national context. So obviously protected areas in Canada might look different than protected areas in Indonesia. So Canada came up with our own application of those definitions. So the main difference again is one's for conservation purposes and one is for some other purpose but has biodiversity outcomes. There was a question about the legal framework. So right now, at least in Canada, there's no legal framework for, there's no legislation or regulation that says this has been stamped as an OECM. There is some legislation in development in Quebec, but it's not in place yet. And so this is why the work of the Forestry Coalition with SFI is looking at all the different kind of mechanisms that we actually already have in place that are either underused or not used at all in terms of recognizing these lands that are set aside for purposes other than conservation. So this is part of the work that we're intending to do over the next year.
That's great. Thanks, Lisa. And Dave, a question just came in and maybe you can answer this one. There's a large focus on looking at air, water, wildlife. NAFO as well as SFI are looking at these. I'm curious if there's any projects that you're looking at on the impacts of soil health.
Not directly, but indirectly, yes. If you think about what we're doing for wildlife habitat, let's take aquatic species, for example. In order for water to be clear and clean, in order for it to sustain the habitat of aquatic species, you have to think about the soil. In some cases, soil deposition into the water is going to have a harmful impact on those species. If we're thinking about the soil carefully, soil and trees like each other. Just ask any farmer that's trying to maintain water quality, what are they going to do? They're going to plant trees to buffer the impact of agriculture on water bodies. Soil and trees like each other, and they work together to enrich the aquatic ecosystem. And so in that way, we're not specifically looking at soil, but soil is fundamental to the benefit of the aquatic ecosystem. And it's fundamental to our water quality best management practices that we're utilizing in order to protect those communities and those environmental attributes. So I would say not directly, but indirectly, it does play a role in each of the areas that we're focusing on.
And Dave, I'll just mention on the heels of that the new SFI forest management standard that was referred to a little while ago, our current standard runs through the end of 2021, but thereafter there'll be a new standard, the consequence of a great revision process that included hundreds and hundreds of partner organizations and individuals. And that's going to take place next year. One of the things that's included in that new forest management standard are more robust requirements around maintaining forest health. And so there's guidance associated with that, and soil health, I should say. And so that is part of our new standard, and our certified organizations are going to become more familiar with that. But I think this is something that has been brought to our attention before, and we saw the opportunity to really beef up the standards in that regard, and it's important to pay attention to. With that, I have a question that I'll turn to Molly to answer. So, Molly, you mentioned the species at risk module that SFI has developed and that you all have worked with, and I'm wondering, how important do you believe it is to because you mentioned early on that since the beginning that SFI certification was part of the way in which you thought about species at risk conservation on Mosaic's lands. And so how important do you think it is to validate and sort of formalize the importance of certification as a tool to bring to bear on species at risk?
Yeah, I think it's essential. And really, I talked about how our conversations with the federal government evolved over the years of our collaboration. And really, we started to realize that that the work being done through forest certification was really meeting the needs of the government. And we just needed to come to the same place in our understanding of what practices on the ground look like, what certification and all of the associated auditing processes do in terms of checking and assuring that we're meeting objectives for species at risk. And the module is really just a deeper dive into existing requirements of the standard. It increases transparency, it clarifies some audit requirements and public reporting, but it doesn't necessarily fundamentally change what a program participant or a certified organization will do. And that was what we saw as the benefit of this module is, this isn't a significant change in our practices. We might be audited somewhat differently, and the public reporting would look somewhat different, but we really saw that certification was going to close this gap between what external organizations might think we are doing or not doing, and what we actually are doing and have been doing for a long time, essentially since we became certified to the SFI forest management standard. As I said, the standard as it exists today already has many requirements around species at risk management, protection of biodiversity, and conservation objectives. So it was really closing a gap around transparency, public reporting, and a shared understanding of the practices of the forest sector.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. A question came in, and Lisa, you're very swift in answering the questions by typing in, but I think it's something that might be of interest to our audience more generally as well. And the question came from Kate Lindsay, and she asked, can Canada or the provinces make more explicit the inclusion of working landscapes where biodiversity conservation is demonstrated? It's my understanding that that's sort of the central concept of OECMs in any case, but maybe you can try to answer that question because I think it's going to be a critical question in the United States soon. And Dave, I may turn to you next to talk a little bit about the President's 30 by 30 intent in the United States. But Lisa, let's hear from you first.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt, right? Like if you just think about the slide that I put up around our progress, OECMs really just has to be a part of our conversation, especially given that, 30 by 30 in Canada means 300 million hectares, right? So we need to be thinking about conservation in an integrated landscape. So these are not just set aside, protected areas, but these are looking at resilient landscapes, whether those are working forests or working landscapes like ranch lands. So absolutely, I think we could be doing more to be raising the profile of OECMs and having them being seriously considered as a part of the protected and conserved area network. And certainly the work of the Forestry Coalition is doing that. And that's in part, again, why we need to be working with some of the certified companies to be able to say, how do we make this real on the ground? And how can we be using some of this as proof of concept so we can take it to some of the provinces and the federal government to say, listen, there is conservation outcomes here and they are protected. So why are we not recognizing the good work that's happening on the ground? And Molly, your answer to that last question was a perfect example. I mean, there's so much work going on around species at risk protection, and being able to demonstrate that. I mean, it's one of the pieces of the puzzle, but certainly the biodiversity outcome is there in many, many places.
Thank you. And as promised, Dave, I'd be very interested, now that we've heard from Lisa about OECMs and how Canada is thinking about their 20 by 25 by 25 goal, their 30 by 30 goal potentially, and this role of OECMs and specifically of managed forests and the conservation outcomes associated with those managed forests. Do you have any insights about, we've heard recently from President Biden about the 30 by 30 concept, but do you have any insights about how that may manifest in terms of the acknowledgement of sustainably managed forests as part of that puzzle?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, there's an old saying that if you're prepared, you shall not fear. And I think that applies to 30 by 30. That's one principle. The second is that it was interesting that 30 by 30 was included in the president's executive order on climate change. So if you think about the administration is drawing a very clear line between climate change and the conservation of other environmental values that have to do with land and water. And so from our standpoint, we were welcoming of the idea of working lands conservation in the interest of achieving this goal of 30% conserved by 2030. We were already doing it. So when the idea was being kicked around in the administration, we could go in and confidently say, not only can you do it, but here's how. And here are a few examples of where it's already working, not just for us on private working forests, but in other areas as well, in this broader idea of conservation without conflict. That was music to the ears of the administration. And I think that what we're going to see playing out going forward is an even greater emphasis on this collaborative conservation. And it's finding its ways into the halls of Congress as well as within the halls of the administration and the various departments and agencies that are involved in 30 by 30. What we hope to do over time, and we think that we will do, we're confident this can and will happen, is for cooperative conservation to be the way of achieving our conservation goals going forward on private working lands. And we're already seeing a very welcoming environment for that idea. And we think it's going to flourish because we have good stories to tell, and we're going to continue to tell good stories of conservation success.
Thank you, Dave. We only have a couple minutes left in this segment. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and seize the opportunity to answer one of the questions myself. We have a question from Katie Reimer, who says, what would you tell a CEO of a company that's considering SFI certification about collaboration and partnerships? That's such a great feeling question to me, and I'm so happy to be able to answer it. I think we've seen a lot of evidence on today's panel, and throughout this conference, you have seen and will see additional evidence about the collaborative posture of SFI across our 4 pillars of work, across the pillars of standards and conservation and education and community. We work very fluidly internal to SFI. And so although the standards are maybe the most visible aspect of our work in many cases, that serves as a foundation for our work, but that's not the only thing that we do. And everything that we do is characterized by this notion of collaborative partnerships. So when we talk about all the conservation work that has been discussed today, and we talk about the education work of our Project Learning Tree program, or the community engagement work in our work with Indigenous peoples and youth education and youth job creation, all of that serves to enrich what it means to be involved with SFI. So I do occasionally have some opportunity to spend time with Jason Metnick and to work with CEOs of companies that are thinking about SFI. And it's always a great pleasure for me to be able to talk about the breadth of our programs. And even if you certify to SFI and you get involved in that one way, you in fact are enriched by the breadth of the programs that SFI is engaged in. And so I think we found that to be true. And I think it's one of the fundamental underlying distinctive factors of SFI certification. So with that, our time has run out for this. I will thank the panel again. Lisa, Molly, and Dave, you all did a super job, and I think gave us a great deal of food for thought. And we so appreciate the fact that you've been with us this afternoon. But with that, we have a very important presentation to make. And you know, we're fortunate to be able to work across these broad collaborative partnerships, and the reverberations of the work of our partners continues to grow and exert leverage on conservation. So with that little hint, I'll turn to my colleague Darren Sleep to offer an awards presentation.
Thank you very much, Paul. For those who don't know me, my name is Darren Sleep. I am SFI's Senior Director of Conservation Science and Strategy. And after that very interesting and thought-provoking session, we're going to turn to something a little bit more lighthearted, but certainly no less important. At this time, SFI is very proud to present our SFI Leadership in Conservation Award. This award is given annually at our conference in recognition of leadership in fostering conservation partnerships, developing innovative approaches, and achieving critical conservation outcomes in North America's forests. Now, over the last decade, I should say, this award has gone to a veritable who's who in forest conservation. It's gone to conservation organizations, certified organizations, and individuals who have made great strides in advancing conservation and managed forests across North America and setting very strong examples of leadership and innovation. Awardees have stepped up to actively demonstrate the value of managed forests to nature and to society, and demonstrated the commitment of them and their organizations to bring that work to the forefront. So if anything, I would say the one consistency across all of our past Conservation Leadership Award winners is the belief that when forests win, we all win. So without further ado, this year, SFI would like to present the award to NCC, Nature Conservancy Canada, and to West Fraser, one of SFI's certified organizations. Now, we're presenting this award in recognition of the hard work and the effort that NCC and West Fraser, and more specifically, Lisa McLaughlin, Vice President of Conservation Policy and Planning at NCC, and Laura Trout, Senior Biologist with West Fraser Hinton Operations, have put into advancing conservation on managed forests in Canada through the identification of what we just heard about, other effective conservation measures. Now, as you heard from Lisa's presentation, the current Canadian federal government has committed to conserving 25% of its terrestrial land base and 25% of its oceans by 2025, and is working towards an ambitious 30 by 30 goal. Now, SFI, NCC, and West Fraser are collaborating with a group of like-minded organizations to ensure that the conservation outcomes of Canada's sustainably managed forests are fully recognized and contribute towards Canada's Target 1 goal for conservation protection. Now, the Target 1 challenge is an investment, a very serious investment by the federal government in projects that add to Canada's protected and conserved areas across this country. Now, as you heard during Lisa's presentation, reaching this ambitious goal will be an incredible challenge. However, in Canada, with 122 million hectares certified to SFI, these well-managed forests have a role to play in achieving the scale necessary to meet that target. Now, other effective conservation measures, or OECMs, it's simply a conservation tool that can be used to recognize areas whose primary purpose is not conservation, but these areas that are managed in such a way that they achieve long-term biodiversity outcomes. Now, I need to say and emphasize that both of the recipients here have helped lead the way through the development and design of an approach and tool to recognize these areas in managed forests in Canada, and by applying and testing that approach in a very practical, on-the-ground way to an SFI certified tenure, which was managed, of course, by West Fraser in Alberta. Lisa, as you've heard, has been a champion for applying the OECM concept on both government lands and private lands. And I can assure you, because I've been working very closely with Lisa, she's helped galvanize relationships and partnerships and help clarify ways to achieve this ambitious goal across this country. Laura at West Fraser was the first to step up and conduct a high-level evaluation of her organization's operations to identify OECMs, and she further engaged partners and thought leaders from different sectors in her area to evaluate the long-term considerations and opportunities for those areas. Her practical approach and West Fraser's support for the analysis has really helped pave the way for others to follow that lead. Lisa and Laura's work taken together has resulted in the very first steps towards acceptance and recognition of the conservation contributions of these well-managed forest lands and the value of SFI forest certification as a validation tool for those OECMs at both provincial and federal levels, which we're anticipating will very much help Canada reach its ambitious conservation targets and further help Canadians recognize the value of managed forests. So without further ado, I'm very proud to present the SFI Leadership and Conservation Award to NCC and West Fraser. I would ask you to join me in congratulating both of these organizations. And I would like to now welcome Lisa first of NCC to accept this award in the same words, following Richard Bryant, West Fraser's Chief Forester in Alberta, who will accept the award on behalf of Laura Trout, who could not be with us today. So over to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Darren. Very kind of you to make this recognition, and I'm just really pleased that OECMs and this tool for conservation is really getting the attention that I think it deserves. It is early days for this work, and like all things in conservation, we're all going to need to work together to see the conservation outcomes on the ground. So I really look forward to continuing to work with SFI and members on this work, and I encourage everyone to learn a little bit more about OECMs and how their operations can play a role in the conserved network in Canada. So thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Over to you, Richard.
Hey, thanks everybody. Yeah, I'm just pleased to accept this award on behalf of West Fraser. As Darren described, our senior biologist, Laura Trout, really deserves most of the credit for this work. It was her vision, passion, and commitment and understanding of our business that resulted in our OECM submission. We were very pleased to provide some real-world case studies within our tenure areas that describe how conservation values are fully consistent with sustainable forest management. As the previous panel really well highlighted, many of us attending this conference understand that sustainable forest management results in healthy, diverse, resilient forests that provide a wide array of ecological, social, and economic values. And through the OECM process, we anticipate that others will learn more about what we do and come to share that view. We thank SFI for the recognition and of this work and this award. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I can honestly say this award is very well deserved, and it's a lot of work, and we will continue down that path. So with that, I will hand it back over to Paul.
Thank you, Darren. I just add my congratulations to everyone else. These two organizations, NCC and West Fraser, have taken the very bold and courageous step of sticking their heads up and being first. And that is sometimes the most difficult thing to do. And in the long run, I believe that this work will continue to gain traction, and that leadership will reverberate in some very, very important ways. So congratulations to your two organizations, to Lisa and to Laura, and we're so proud to have been able to make that presentation to you today. So once again, we want to thank our panel for the collaboration on species at risk and conservation impact. I thought it was a very compelling discussion. We want to close out by remembering our sponsors once again and by thanking them again. Please welcome or make thanks with us to Rayonier as a gold sponsor, as well as Bureau Veritas and Georgia Pacific as silver sponsors of this particular session. We so appreciate it. This webinar will remain open until until the next top of the hour at 1 o'clock Eastern time. And if you stick around, you'll see a video from our gold sponsor, Rayonier. And so we hope that you'll take advantage of that opportunity and do that as well. At the top of the hour, we hope you'll rejoin us for a discussion about building a diverse and resilient workforce, which I think is going to be extremely valuable and timely for all of us. And so I hope you'll join us then. Once again, thanks to our sponsors, thanks to our panel, and thanks to all of you who have joined us through this morning. It's been a great discussion. Thank you.